The first sign of trouble came just before dawn. A convoy of black SUVs rolled silently through the misty roads of Silver Creek, Montana. Their headlights cut through the darkness like hungry eyes, prowling toward Blackwood Ranch. The men inside were confident, just another easy acquisition. Another frightened landowner ready to fold under the weight of money and threats. But Elena Blackwood was not just another landowner. Standing on her porch, coffee in hand, she watched the approaching vehicles with the quiet focus of a hunter. Her steel-gray eyes remained steady, betraying neither fear nor surprise. At her feet, 3 massive wolves, Ash, Titan, and Sable, stood motionless, their ears pricked forward, reading her body language. They sensed the shift in the air, the invisible current of danger. "Visitors," she murmured. Ash, the white alpha, let out a low growl, his breath curling in the cold morning air. Titan, the largest of the 3, tensed, while Sable, the youngest but fiercest, shifted impatiently. Elena set her coffee down, adjusting the worn leather strap of the rifle slung over her shoulder. She had known this day would come. A knock echoed through the crisp morning air, sharp, deliberate. She let the silence stretch before opening the door. The man standing before her was dressed impeccably, charcoal suit, polished shoes, an air of authority that reeked of power. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "Miss Blackwood," he greeted, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "My name is Victor Kazarian. My employers have an interest in your land." Elena leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Not for sale." Kazarian chuckled, glancing at the wolves. "A shame. My employers are very generous." She held his gaze, her expression unreadable. "And I'm very stubborn." A flicker of irritation crossed his features, gone as quickly as it came. "Miss Blackwood," he sighed, slipping his hands into his pockets. "We both know how this goes. First, we offer money. Then, we apply pressure. And if that doesn't work," he tilted his head slightly, "accidents happen." Titan rumbled a warning, a sound so deep it vibrated through the wooden planks of the porch. Kazarian's men shifted uneasily. Elena smiled faintly. "Be careful making threats on my land, Mr. Kazarian. Some of us bite back." The air between them tightened, a silent battle of wills. Then Kazarian exhaled sharply, giving a small, almost amused nod. "I'll give you time to reconsider." She didn't answer. As the SUVs rumbled away, disappearing into the morning fog, Elena turned to her wolves. Sable let out a sharp, eager bark. "They'll be back," she murmured, fingers tightening around the rifle. The battle for Silver Creek had begun. Elena Blackwood never wanted to come back to Silver Creek. She had left this town behind years ago, trading the quiet Montana wilderness for the sandstorms of Afghanistan. As an elite operative in a classified military unit, she had hunted warlords and dismantled drug networks in the most hostile terrains imaginable. But when her father passed away, leaving her the sprawling Blackwood Ranch, she returned not because she wanted to, but because she owed him that much. Now the same skills that had once made her a ghost on the battlefield kept her alive in a different kind of war. Silver Creek was no stranger to hardship. A small town tucked between vast mountain ranges and endless forests, it had survived decades of economic decline. But the past year had brought something worse than hard times. Strangers started buying up land at impossible prices. Accidents became frequent, barns burned down, livestock poisoned, roads mysteriously blocked. Some families packed up and left. Others stayed, too afraid to speak up. And now, Victor Kazarian had come knocking. Elena knew his type well, men who didn't ask twice. Men who saw patience as a courtesy, not a necessity. And when patience ran out, they made examples of people. She wasn't about to let that happen. Not everyone in Silver Creek was willing to roll over. Sheriff Mark Randall was one of the few who still had a spine. A broad-shouldered man with lines of worry etched deep into his face. He had spent 2 decades keeping the peace in a town that rarely needed much law enforcement. Now he found himself hopelessly outgunned. The local police force consisted of just 4 officers, good men, but not trained for what was coming. Town's already half bought, Randall muttered over a cup of stale diner coffee the morning after Kazarian's visit. Most folks are too scared to fight. Hell, half of them are just hoping to be left alone. Elena stirred her coffee absently. And you? He snorted. I don't scare easy. Then there was Amelia Carter, the town's veterinarian and one of Elena's few remaining friends. She had grown up with Elena, back when the biggest problems in their world were school dances and summer storms. Now she spent her days tending to more than just animals. She patched up people too, the ones too afraid to go to the hospital when trouble found them. They're pushing harder, Amelia said one evening, treating a fresh wound on Titan's flank. 3 ranches sold last week. Cash offers. Way above market value. Elena narrowed her eyes. Who's next? Amelia hesitated before answering. Richard Owens. Elena's jaw tightened. Richard had been her father's closest friend. If they were going after him next, it meant they were done playing nice. She exhaled slowly, watching the sun dip below the mountains. They want a fight? She murmured. Then let's give them one. The first real blow came faster than Elena expected. 3 nights after Kazarian's visit, Richard Owens' barn burned to the ground. The fire raged high into the night, turning the sky a furious shade of orange. By the time Elena and Sheriff Randall arrived, the structure was nothing more than smoldering ruins. The old man stood outside, watching in stunned silence as the last of his cattle trapped inside let out dying cries. His hands trembled, whether from anger or grief. Elena couldn't tell. Gasoline, Randall muttered, kneeling near the scorched earth. Not an accident. Richard exhaled sharply, jaw clenched. Bastards came by 2 days ago. Told me to sell. Said it'd be easier that way. He looked at Elena, eyes dark with a familiar kind of sorrow. I told them no. She already knew what came next. A warning. A demonstration of power. The fire hadn't just been about forcing Richard's hand, it was about fear, a message to the rest of Silver Creek. If a man like Richard, who had lived on this land for 50 years, could be brought to his knees, then no one was safe. Elena scanned the tree line beyond the ranch, instincts prickling. She could feel eyes watching. She could almost hear the quiet satisfaction of the men responsible, lurking just beyond reach. Titan let out a low growl beside her. He sensed it too. Randall straightened, spitting to the side. You know what's gonna happen next. Elena nodded. They weren't just here to buy, they were here to take. And the moment someone resisted, the stakes would only rise. Later that night, she sat on her porch, rifle across her lap, watching the road. She wasn't stupid enough to think they'd stop at Richard. And she had no intention of waiting until it was her barn burning. The next morning, another message arrived. Jose Vega, one of the ranch hands who had worked at Blackwood Ranch since before Elena was born, found his truck ransacked. Tires slashed, windows shattered. And on the hood, in bold red spray paint, a simple phrase, leave. Jose stared at the words for a long moment, then let out a bitter chuckle. Real original. Elena glanced at Randall, who stood with arms crossed, frowning. They're getting sloppy. Randall nodded. Desperation. They don't like resistance. Elena looked back at the truck. Then let's give them more of it. That evening, she made her first move. Dressed in black, she slipped through the night like a shadow, her wolves moving soundlessly beside her. The target was a warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place that, on paper, was nothing more than a storage facility. But Elena had spent enough years in war zones to recognize a staging ground when she saw one. She kept low, pressing against the cold metal of the outer wall, listening. Voices inside. Men talking in Russian, confirming everything she suspected. She turned to Titan, giving a silent command. The massive wolf trotted forward, circling the back entrance. Seconds later, a sharp, piercing howl shattered the night. Panic erupted inside. The door burst open as one of the men stepped out, gun raised. Before he could react, Alina moved. A swift, brutal strike to the throat sent him crumpling. Another stepped forward, shouting. She slammed his head into the steel wall, knocking him unconscious before he could fire a shot. She ducked inside, quick and efficient, eyes scanning the interior. Weapons, ammunition, smuggled goods. Everything she needed to prove that this was more than a simple land grab. She pulled out her phone, snapping photos. Then she heard a low, deliberate chuckle from the far side of the room. She turned, gun raised, as Viktor Khazarian stepped into view. Alina didn't hesitate. Her finger tightened on the trigger, the sights of her pistol locked onto Khazarian's chest. But the bastard didn't flinch. He simply raised his hands in mock surrender, a smirk playing at the edges of his mouth. "Well," he mused, voice calm, measured. "I suppose I should be flattered. You tracked me here so quickly. Or should I be concerned?" Elena's gaze flickered to the side, scanning for threats. No one else was visible, but that meant nothing. Men like Khazarian never traveled alone. "I came for answers," she said evenly. "Looks like I found them." He chuckled. "And what exactly do you think you've found, Miss Blackwood? A few crates? Some weapons? Hardly enough to warrant your little midnight raid." She gestured around the warehouse. "You're staging something here. This isn't just about Silver Creek." His smile widened. "Very good." That was the moment she heard it, a faint shift in the air, the whisper of movement behind her. Instinct screamed at her to move, and she did, twisting to the side just as a fist sliced through the space where her head had been. She spun low, kicking out, her boot connecting with the attacker's knee. He grunted, stumbling, and she finished the movement with a sharp elbow to the temple, sending him crashing to the ground. By the time she turned back, Khazarian was already walking away. "Impressive," he called over his shoulder, not even bothering to look back. "But you're still playing defense, Miss Blackwood. That's going to get tiring." He stepped through the warehouse doors, vanishing into the night. Alina exhaled sharply, grounding herself. Then she retrieved her phone and sent the photos to Randall. "Got what we need. Be ready." She melted back into the shadows, her wolves joining her as she disappeared into the night. The next morning, the escalation began. Randall's office was filled with tension. The sheriff leaned over his desk, flipping through the pictures on Elena's phone. His jaw tightened with every image. "This is bad," he muttered. "Real bad." "They're running more than just intimidation," Elena said. "Weapons, logistics. This isn't about Silver Creek, it's a waypoint in something much bigger." Randall rubbed a hand down his face. "I don't have the manpower to take this on, Elena." "You won't have to." He looked up, frowning. She crossed her arms. "We don't fight them like they fight us. We fight smarter. We use the land, the town, the people who aren't ready to roll over." Randall hesitated. Then slowly he nodded. "You got a plan?" Elena's lips curled into a cold smile. "Yeah. We make them regret coming here." Elena wasted no time. She and Randall split up, each with a list of people to talk to, those who still had some fight left in them. She went to Jose first. He was already waiting at the ranch, arms crossed, eyes dark with understanding. "I saw the pictures," he said. "It's worse than I thought." She nodded. "They're not just here to buy land. They're setting up something bigger. And if we let them dig in, we'll never get them out." Jose exhaled sharply. "I'm in." One by one, she gathered them. Amelia, who knew how to patch up wounds that shouldn't be reported to hospitals. Richard Owens, despite his losses, ready to fight back however he could. A few ranch hands, young but angry, tired of watching their town being picked apart. Even Anita from the diner, she wasn't much for fighting, but she knew everyone and could keep an ear to the ground. By nightfall, they had a plan. The first step was simple: make life hell for Khazarian's men. Elena had spent years mastering unconventional warfare, and she knew exactly how to use it. They started small disruptions, sabotage, the kind of harassment that wasn't enough to justify a full response, but would keep the bastards on edge. Jose and the ranch hands took to the roads, laying out spike strips in the dead of night. Amelia fed false rumors to the newcomers, stirring paranoia among them. Elena and her wolves did what they did best: stalking, watching, waiting. Every night, they made their presence known. A sudden, eerie howl in the darkness. A ranch light flickering off, leaving someone alone in the night, just long enough to remind them they weren't safe. Men who thought they were predators started to feel like prey. It didn't take long for Khazarian to react. His men doubled their patrols, started carrying bigger weapons, driving in pairs. But that only made them predictable. Elena used it against them. One night, she and Titan tracked a small convoy heading to the warehouse. She waited until they reached a narrow, isolated stretch of road before setting the plan in motion. A carefully placed oil slick sent the lead SUV skidding, its tires screeching before it crashed into a ditch. The second vehicle braked too hard, swerving wildly, buying her just enough time to strike. She moved fast, disabling the first driver before he could react. The second man barely had time to reach for his gun before Titan lunged, knocking him to the ground. They weren't dead, just shaken, humiliated. A message. By the time they crawled back to town, beaten and rattled, Khazarian's patience had run out. That's when he escalated. 2 days later, Richard Owens disappeared. They found his truck abandoned near the canyon, the driver's side door left open. No sign of struggle, no note, no ransom demand, just an absence that screamed louder than anything. Elena stood at the edge of the canyon, fists clenched. "They're making an example," Randall said grimly. "They think fear will do the work for them." But fear worked both ways. Elena turned to Titan, then to the others. "We take him back," she said. "And we send a message of our own." They found Richard Owens at sunrise. Elena had spent the night tracking, moving through the dense forest with Titan at her side. The older man was bound and beaten, dumped near the river like discarded trash. His face was swollen, his shirt torn and stained with blood, but he was alive. When Elena knelt beside him, he stirred, blinking up at her through one swollen eye. "Told them I wasn't selling," he rasped. "Guess they didn't like that." Randall arrived minutes later with Jose and Amelia. They worked quickly, lifting Richard into the truck while Amelia checked his wounds. Broken ribs, a nasty gash along his temple, but nothing fatal. He was lucky. Elena knew that luck wouldn't last. "This was a warning," Randall muttered. "They're done playing around." Elena's jaw tightened. "So are we." She knew Khazarian expected them to be afraid, expected them to back down. But that wasn't going to happen. If he wanted a war, she was going to bring it to him on her terms. The first strike came that night. The warehouse where Khazarian stored his shipments sat just beyond the southern ridge, a reinforced structure with armed guards posted at every entrance. It was a fortress, but every fortress had weak points. Elena had spent the past week studying their rotations, their patterns. She knew exactly when to move. Jose and Randall took the west side, setting up diversions, small explosives, nothing deadly, just enough to cause chaos. Amelia stayed back with a radio, monitoring police channels. Elena, meanwhile, took the east. Moving like a shadow, she scaled the outer fence, landing silently in the tall grass. Titan followed, his massive frame somehow just as quiet. They slipped between the storage containers, keeping low, invisible. The first explosion went off. A sudden burst of light and sound, sending guards scrambling. The second followed seconds later, near the front gate. By the time Khazarian's men realized it was a distraction, Elena was already inside. She moved fast. A guard turned the corner, barely having time to register her presence before she struck two quick blows, precise, efficient. He crumpled before he could even make a sound. She grabbed his radio, listening. "All units report." "What the hell is going on out there?" Khazarian's voice. "He was here." Elena smiled grimly. "Good." She reached the storage area and pulled out her knife, slicing open the nearest crate. Her breath caught. Guns. High-grade military rifles, explosives, even body armor. More than what was needed to control a small town. This was bigger. Much bigger. She grabbed her phone, snapping photos. Then an alarm blared. Damn it. Footsteps pounded against the concrete, voices shouting. Elena turned, heart hammering. The exit was too far. They'd cut her off before she reached it. Titan growled low beside her. She whispered a command. "Go." The Wolf vanished into the darkness, slipping between the crates. Seconds later, a scream rang out. Then another. Elena used the distraction, sprinting toward the emergency exit. She shoved the door open just as gunfire erupted behind her. Bullets tore through the metal, missing her by inches. She hit the ground rolling, pushing to her feet in one fluid motion. Jose's truck screeched to a stop ahead, Randall already aiming from the passenger seat. "Move!" She leaped into the back as Jose floored it. The engine roared, tires kicking up dust as they sped away. Behind them, the warehouse burned. Khazarian was furious. The attack on the warehouse had cost him more than just supplies. It had exposed him. By morning, half the town had seen the smoke rising over the ridge, and rumors spread like wildfire. People whispered about gunfire, about shadows moving in the night, about something bigger than just a land dispute. Elena knew that was dangerous. Fear could break a town just as easily as violence, but it could also unite one. Khazarian's response was immediate. He doubled the number of men patrolling Silver Creek, black SUVs prowling the streets at all hours. A few of his enforcers walked into the diner that afternoon, sat at the counter, and stared at Anita until her hands shook as she poured their coffee. A not-so-subtle reminder of who controlled the town. Elena didn't wait for them to make the next move. That night, she and Randall struck again, this time hitting the fuel depot on the outskirts. It was a simple job: cut the power, disable the cameras, set the charges. When the tanks went up, the fire was visible for miles. Supplies were nothing without fuel to move them. By the time Khazarian realized he was under siege, it was too late to stop it. But he adapted. The next morning, Jose found his house ransacked. His dog was missing. A message plain and cruel. Randall's deputy started getting calls from unknown numbers, voices promising their families wouldn't be safe if they didn't stand down. The threats were getting personal. Elena saw it coming. She gathered the others in the barn that night, speaking low, controlled. "They want to scare us, make us second guess. But we don't break." She looked at each of them and turned Randall, jaw clenched, already committed. Amelia, determined despite the fear in her eyes. Jose, quieter than usual but nodding. "We push harder." So they did. Elena took the next step, striking at Khazarian's money. He was laundering his operations through a real estate firm in town, clean on paper, but dirty underneath. Jose slipped into their offices just before closing, planting a bug in the manager's computer. By morning, Elena had access to their financials. And then, with a few keystrokes, she bled them dry. Khazarian woke up to frozen accounts, flagged transactions, audits from federal agencies he didn't even know were watching. It wasn't enough to break him, but it was enough to make him desperate. That's when he made his biggest mistake. They came for Elena at dawn. 5 men, masked, armed. They moved quietly, cutting the fence, slipping through the fields. But she was already awake. Titan sensed them first, his ears twitching, a silent snarl curling his lips. Elena rolled out of bed without hesitation, grabbing her rifle. She waited until they were close. Then she turned off the porch light. The world plunged into darkness. And then the wolves attacked. The first man never saw it coming. One moment he was moving through the tall grass, rifle at the ready, and the next, a blur of fur and fangs slammed into him from the side. Titan's weight alone sent him sprawling, but it was the wolf's teeth clamping around his forearm that made him scream. The sound barely had time to escape his throat before Elena fired, the suppressed shot barely a whisper in the dark. The second man turned just in time to see his partner go down, but before he could react, Sable streaked through the shadows, jaws latching onto his leg. He staggered, cursing, swinging his rifle wildly, but Elena was already moving. A sharp strike to the back of his head sent him crumpling to the dirt. The other 3 scattered, shouting in Russian, but Elena was already tracking them. She dropped low, listening. Footsteps, fast, erratic. They were panicked now, no longer the hunters, but the hunted. One of them fired blindly into the night, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the dark, but he was shooting at ghosts. The wolves had vanished, shifting through the landscape like phantoms, waiting for her command. Elena exhaled, steady, focused. Then she whispered, "Go." Ash struck first, silent and swift, taking down the 3rd man before he even knew what hit him. The 4th tried to run, crashing through the brush toward the fence line, but Elena was already there. She stepped into his path, her pistol leveled. He skidded to a halt, breathing hard, eyes wild. "Drop it," she said, her voice calm, absolute. For a second, she thought he might. Then his fingers twitched toward his belt. A knife. Stupid. She shot him in the leg. He crumpled with a choked cry, clutching the wound, and before he could think about reaching for another weapon, Titan was there, standing over him, growling low in his throat. One left. Elena turned, scanning the darkness. The last man had disappeared into the trees, but she wasn't worried. She didn't need to chase him. She wanted him to run. She wanted him to report back to Khazarian, to tell him what had happened here, to tell him that he had made a mistake. She knelt beside the wounded man, pressing the barrel of her gun against his forehead. "Tell your boss," she murmured. "I'm not the one who should be afraid." Then she stood, whistled once, and the wolves followed her back into the night. Khazarian's retaliation came fast. By midday, his men were everywhere, searching the town, questioning people, making it clear that the rules had changed. The tension in Silver Creek was suffocating. Anita's diner sat half empty, people afraid to be seen in the wrong place, with the wrong people. Randall's deputies were stretched thin, trying to keep order without making themselves targets. Amelia's clinic was too busy. Elena knew this couldn't go on forever. Khazarian was too invested, too deep. He wouldn't walk away, which meant it was time to end this. That night, she called everyone to the ranch. Randall, Jose, Amelia, the few who were still willing to fight. She laid it out plain. "We finish this," she said. "Tomorrow." Nobody argued. Because they all knew one way or another, this war was coming to an end. The final battle began before dawn. Elena knew Khazarian would come. She had humiliated him, crippled his operations, and sent his men running like frightened prey. A man like him couldn't let that stand. He had to retaliate. Had to remind everyone why he was feared. That was his mistake. She was counting on it. They had spent the night preparing. The ranch was fortified, not in the traditional sense, but in the way only someone like Elena could manage. She had set traps, planned ambush points, turned every inch of her land into a weapon. Randall and Jose covered the perimeter, positioning themselves near the tree line. Amelia stayed inside the house, ready to move if anyone was injured. The wolves prowled the darkness, their senses honed, waiting for the first sign of movement. And then, just as the sky began to lighten, the attack came. A low rumble of engines echoed through the valley. Black SUVs, a dozen or more, moving fast, their headlights cutting through the early morning fog. Elena stood on the porch, rifle in hand, watching them come. Her pulse was steady. This was what she had been trained for. The vehicle skidded to a stop at the edge of her land. Doors swung open. Men poured out, armed and ready, their faces grim. They weren't here to negotiate. Kazarian stepped out last. He looked different now. Less composed. More desperate. "Elena Blackwood," he called, his voice carrying over the distance. "Enough games. This ends now." She raised an eyebrow. "I agree." Then she fired the first shot. The bullet slammed into the hood of one of the SUVs, sending sparks flying. The reaction was immediate. Kazarian's men scattered, taking cover, returning fire. But they had no idea what they had walked into. Randall and Jose struck from the trees, their shots precise, calculated. 2 men dropped before they even knew where the attack was coming from. The wolves moved next. Ashen Sable darted through the tall grass, a blur of teeth and fury, striking fast before vanishing back into the darkness. Panic spread through the ranks. They weren't fighting a simple landowner anymore. They were fighting something else entirely. Elena moved like a ghost, slipping between cover, picking off targets one by one. She could hear Kazarian shouting orders, trying to regain control, but it was useless. His men were breaking. They weren't prepared for this kind of fight. And then finally, she saw her real target. Kazarian was falling back, moving toward one of the SUVs, reaching for his radio, calling for reinforcements. She couldn't let that happen. Elena sprinted forward, dodging bullets, closing the distance. Kazarian saw her too late. He turned, raising his gun, but she was faster. She slammed into him, knocking the weapon from his grip. They hit the ground hard, rolling, fighting for control. He was strong, but she was stronger. With one final brutal movement, she flipped him onto his back, pinning him. Her knife was at his throat before he could react. "It's over," she said, breathing hard. Kazarian stared up at her, eyes wild, chest rising and falling rapidly. "Elena," he rasped. "You think this ends with me?" She pressed the blade deeper, just enough to make her point. "I think you won't be around to find out." Then, from behind, a voice shouted, "Elena, stop!" She turned her head slightly, just enough to see Randall running toward her, gun still raised. "Don't," he said. "We need him alive." For a long moment, she considered ignoring him, ending it. But then she exhaled sharply, pulling back, flipping the knife in her grip before slamming the handle into Kazarian's skull. He went limp. Randall sighed. "That works too." The fight was over. But the war wasn't. The battlefield was silent now, save for the occasional groan of the wounded. Smoke curled from burning vehicles, the acrid scent mixing with the crisp morning air. Kazarian's men were either dead, unconscious, or fleeing into the woods, leaving their boss sprawled in the dirt, blood seeping from the gash on his forehead. Elena stood over him, knife still in hand, heart still pounding. Randall and Jose moved through the wreckage, securing weapons, checking the bodies. Amelia rushed from the house, a medical kit slung over her shoulder, her eyes scanning for survivor's friend or foe. It didn't matter. Randall kicked over one of the fallen gunmen, checking for signs of life. "Damn," he muttered, shaking his head. "We just declared war on some very bad people." Elena exhaled sharply. "No. They declared war on us. We just finished it." Jose glanced up from where he was zip-tying one of the remaining conscious thugs. "Finished?" He nodded toward Kazarian. "Not unless we bury that son of a bitch right now." Kazarian groaned, blinking against the blood dripping into his eyes. He let out a dry chuckle, a hoarse sound of amusement that made Elena's grip tighten around her knife. "You really think this is over?" he rasped. Elena crouched beside him, ignoring the ache in her ribs. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I do." Kazarian grinned, teeth stained red. "You have no idea who you're up against." Elena pressed her knife against his cheek, just enough for him to feel the cold steel. "Neither do you." The moment stretched, heavy and taut. Then Randall sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "As much as I'd love to see how this plays out, we've got a bigger problem." Elena didn't look away from Kazarian. "What?" Randall nodded toward the road. "Reinforcements." She followed his gaze. In the distance, dust clouds billowed along the main highway. Vehicles. More of them. Bigger. Heavily armored. Backup had arrived. Jose cursed under his breath. Amelia straightened, her face hardening. Elena stood slowly, rolling her shoulders. The exhaustion clawed at her limbs, but she pushed it down. They had prepared for this. They knew it wouldn't end with one fight. She turned to Randall. "We stick to the plan." He hesitated, then nodded. "You sure about this?" Elena's lips curled into a sharp, humorless smile. "No," she admitted. "But we don't have a choice." The second wave was coming. And this time, they had to finish it for good. Elena didn't waste a second. She grabbed Kazarian by the collar, dragging him toward the barn as Jose and Randall rushed to reposition themselves. The incoming convoy was moving fast, too fast for them to prepare an ambush like before, but that didn't mean they were defenseless. The remaining explosives were still in place, rigged along the dirt road leading into the ranch. Jose sprinted toward the trigger points, taking cover behind a rusted tractor as Randall barked orders to the others. Amelia rushed back inside, securing whatever medical supplies she could. The wolves circled anxiously, sensing the coming violence. Kazarian coughed, spitting blood as Elena shoved him against a wooden post inside the barn. His smile hadn't faded. "You're making a mistake," he rasped. "You kill me, and another will take my place." She ignored him, securing his wrists with thick rope. "I don't care about replacements. I care about ending this." Outside, the first vehicle screeched to a halt. Armed men poured out, tactical gear gleaming under the morning sun. These weren't the same low-level thugs Kazarian had brought before. These were professionals. Their movements were coordinated, disciplined. Elena adjusted her rifle, steadying her breathing. The first explosion ripped through the air as Jose triggered the charges, sending a fireball into the sky. The lit SUV was flung onto its side, flames consuming its frame. The men inside never had a chance. The others reacted instantly, spreading out, returning fire toward the tree line where Randall and the others were positioned. Bullets tore through branches, shattering wood. But Randall held firm, taking careful shots, dropping 2 men before they could reach cover. Elena moved. She sprinted along the side of the barn, keeping low as she aimed at a figure near the second vehicle. One precise shot to the knee sent him sprawling. Another to the shoulder ensured he stayed down. She didn't have the ammo to waste. Every bullet had to count. The wolves struck next. Titan and Ash darted through the smoke, their speed unnatural, their presence more terrifying than the gunfire. A man screamed as Ash clamped down on his forearm, tearing him away from his weapon. Another tried to retreat but didn't get far before Titan barreled into him, sending him crashing into the dirt. The remaining mercenaries hesitated. They had expected resistance, but not this. Not creatures that moved like shadows, striking before vanishing. Elena used their hesitation. She surged forward, taking down another as Jose reloaded behind her. Randall shouted a warning, but she had already sensed the shift. Someone was flanking them from the east, moving fast. She spun just as the attacker lunged. They hit the ground hard, her rifle knocked from her grasp. The man was bigger, stronger, but Elena had spent years fighting in worse conditions. She drove her elbow into his throat, rolled with the momentum, and slammed her knee into his ribs. He gasped, faltering, just long enough for her to grab the knife strapped to her thigh and drive it into his side. He went limp. She staggered to her feet, heart hammering. The battle was tilting in their favor. Khazarian's forces were breaking, their numbers dwindling. Another explosion rocked the field as Jose triggered the final charge, sending shrapnel flying. The last of the mercenaries scrambled for the remaining vehicles, desperate to escape. Elena saw Khazarian watching from the barn, still bound but grinning. "You think this is a victory?" He called over the chaos. "This isn't the end. You've made enemies you don't even understand." She wiped the sweat from her brow, leveling her gaze at him. "Good," she said. "Let them come." With that, she turned, raised her pistol, and fired one last shot right into the gas tank of the remaining SUV. The explosion swallowed the last of Khazarian's reinforcements. Silver Creek was theirs again.